Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Noelle Norton. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our AI and the Humanities lecture series hosted by the USD Humanities Center. And this is our very first of the four-part lecture series. This series is part of the Humanities Center's ongoing multidisciplinary programming around artificial intelligence and the intellectual and moral challenges it poses. We are bringing together international scholars over the next several weeks from across many different disciplines to join us to explore vital theological and ethical questions raised by AI, impacts of AI on social life, and the nature of the mind and thought itself. So I'm just here to welcome all of you. I'm turning this morning's program over to Dr. Hannah Holtzman. She is our Keck postdoctoral fellow in critical technology studies in the Humanities Center. Dr. Holtzman coordinates the AI learning group and our critical technology studies reading group, which has been quite exciting. She will begin by introducing our guest speaker. So everybody, please enjoy. It's lovely to see you all kind of behind your black screens.
Great, thank you so much, Dean Norton. And thank you also, I see that Brian Clack, the director of the Humanities Center, has joined us today. So
great.
Thank you as well for all your support with our work in artificial intelligence and the humanities. So just before introducing today's speaker, I want to give a brief overview of this series, which will be taking place over the next few Mondays. Today, we're exceptionally at 10 a.m. and the other talks will all be at noon Pacific time, just so that people are aware of that. So next week, we have Dr. Carissa Veliz from the University of Oxford. April 26th, we have Dr. Sylvester Johnson from Virginia Tech. And May 3rd, we have Patricia Churchland, formerly at University of California, San Diego. So that is the plan for the next month or so. And let's see, just stop sharing there. Okay, so we hope that you can join us for this ongoing conversation around social and ethical questions raised by artificial intelligence. And also for today, we invite you during the talk to keep your cameras off, just to minimize our collective environmental impact of streaming video. And then once the Q&A begins at the end, we would be happy for you to turn your cameras back on to ask questions. So it's a real honor and pleasure to be introducing Mark Coeckelbergh today. Dr. Coeckelbergh is Professor of Philosophy of Media and Technology in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, as well as Vice Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Education and former President of the Society for Philosophy and Technology. Dr. Coeckelbergh is a member of advisory bodies in the area of policy for artificial intelligence and robotics, including the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence for the European Commission, the Austrian Council on Robotics and Artificial Intelligence, and the Advisory Council on Automated Mobility. Currently, he is involved in a number of European research projects in the area of robotics and AI, and member of several advisory and editorial boards. And his many highly regarded publications include, and this is just from the past decade, Growing Moral Relations, Human Being at Risk, Environmental Skill, Money Machines, New Romantic Cyborgs, Using Words and Things, and most recently, Moved by Machines from 2019, Introduction to Philosophy of Technology from 2019 with Oxford University Press, and AI Ethics from 2020 with MIT Press. He has also published numerous articles in the area of philosophy of technology. So we're so grateful that you're able to join us today. Without further ado, I would like to say welcome, Mark Coeckelbergh, and turn it over to you for your talk, Ethics of AI, Narratives and Responsibility.
Hi, good evening, or good morning to you at USD. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I'm very honored to be part of this lecture series at USD. I think it's a great lineup, and I'm looking forward to interact with all of you listening and watching now. Today I will talk about artificial intelligence and its ethical aspects, and I will also say a few words about narrative in the context of that ethics of AI. Let me pull up my presentation. Let's see. So normally you should be able to see my screen now. Right, so first I will talk about some narratives in general that are around about AI. Then I will go into the ethical problems, and at the end of my presentation put that in a global context. So that's the idea. And yeah, most of the most recent work on narrative is something that I start connecting back to the ethics, and I'm interested to see what you think of this. Narratives about AI can be very particular. When it's in the area of ethics, we all know of some examples that have been in the press where ethical problems with AI were raised, and there's a lot of attention nowadays for the issue of bias. This is a story from the New York Times where a man got arrested, but unjustified. But what happened was basically that the facial recognition system using artificial intelligence was faulty, and then the humans acted on that without really critically questioning the results of the AI, and in this case, without doing the proper police work that will be necessary for that. I will come back to that case later. What this kind of cases show us is very specific ethical problems, but I think it's good to, before we start with the ethical problems, to also look at the general narratives that are there in our culture about AI. And I distinguish here between transhumanist narratives, humanist narratives, and post-humanist narratives. So when we think about artificial intelligence, we are often influenced by science fiction and by transhumanist ideas. And the transhumanist narrative is about a development of intelligence that's first animal intelligence, then becomes human intelligence, and at some point becomes artificial intelligence, which then leads to an intelligence explosion, which means that maybe there is no place anymore for humans as they are, and humans needs to be upgraded. Humans might merge with machines, humans might upload themselves. And in the end of the story, the outlook that's provided is that this intelligence explosion goes on in the universe, that intelligent entities spread through the cosmos, and so that there is a kind of narrative of expanding and spreading intelligence. The transhumanist narrative is influential, especially in the part where it comes to super intelligence that becomes more intelligent than humans, and that might take over from humans on Earth. And so this is something that transhumanists don't necessarily fear. They discuss the risks, but they think that it's a good thing that the intelligence evolves, expands in this way. The humanist narrative, by contrast, doesn't necessarily disagree with the narrative just sketched, but says that this would be a very bad kind of thing to happen. So the evaluation is totally different. and the humanist values that we have from the past are defended against what is seen as a threat coming from technology. So in some ways, the humanist narrative is the negative of the transhumanist one. Usually, humanists, though, also do not really believe in this intelligence explosion or the singularity, a point when we no longer have control, no longer understand what's happening, and this acceleration. But even if they do, they definitely don't want that. They want to defend the human, keep the human, and technology is seen as a threat. And this has a long cultural history that goes back in modern times, at least to the 19th century, where we have, for example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is really the story of a creator abandoning technology rather than technology taking over and being against the creator. That only happens after the technology, the monster in Frankenstein is betrayed in a way by its creator. But nevertheless, this is usually read as a story that warns us for technology. We can also go back to more ancient myths, but it's something that's very deep in our culture. Technology as a threat, technology as some kind of monster that radically disrupts the human story. So we have that, and around that, in my book Neuromantic Cyborgs, I connect this also with this 19th century culture of romanticism, which then also still influence, I think, the way we look at technology today. So that's the humanist narrative. There is also a post-humanist narrative, and by post-humanism here I exclude transhumanism, but I mean narratives that focus more on the positive possibilities of being with others. This could be artificial others, like robots with artificial intelligence, but could also be animals. It could be any kind of hybrid of all these. So there's a kind of positive story of let all these creatures and critters live, and let's live together with others, whatever their ontological status might be. So that's a narrative, for example, we find in Donna Haraway, who then also writes about animals, for example, and Haraway used it also for her feminist political to make her feminist political points. But there's definitely also a narrative there about the future and about the present, that on this earth we can live together with all these different creatures that roam the earth. In science fiction, many of these kind of stories are taken up, especially the transhumanist and humanist ones. There's a lot less science fiction that goes into the post-humanist direction, I would say. This because of the films is something that's very familiar to us. Now, if we compare that to the actual AI that we're having, then these stories about artificial intelligence, be it transhumanist, humanist, or post-humanist, are not really that relevant, at least not when we want to look at the ethics of this technology, because we don't have general AI. We have AI for specific purposes, and even a text generator like GPT-3 is not general AI. It does something very specific. It can put search and put text together. That's pretty impressive, and there are many impressive technologies around, including AI. Think also about the AI that was used to play the game Go. But it's not general AI, and it does not, the existence of these technologies do not warrant giving a lot of credibility, I think, to these big narratives about the future of AI, as if AI is going to surpass us in general intelligence and have all this future consequences. So this is the situation we have. It's the AI that's in our phone that's relevant, the AI that is powering all kind of applications on the internet. So that is something that's there, and it's something that actually already shapes our lives, that we start depending on. Many of us, for example, depend on the search function of Google. And so I think it's interesting to look at that kind of AI, the AI that's actually often hidden, because we're so used to it, basically, the AI that we are already using. And then there are some problems that could be in the near future very relevant, and that are ethically and societally relevant. For example, yes, AI may take some of the jobs, may do some tasks on the job that are now done by humans. This will have actually consequences. Will have consequences on the work floor, but also consequences in the end for our societies, our economies, for the labor market. Some people will lose their jobs, some people will get new jobs. There's a huge discussion about that. Future of work, and it raises all kind of interesting philosophical questions about the value of work, about the meaning of work, and in the end, the meaning of human lives. What is a meaningful life? What is a good life? These are ancient philosophical questions. There are also more down-to-earth questions about privacy and data protection and security. So, of course, many of these systems can be accessed by someone who knows what she or he is doing, and this is very problematic. Also, even if there is no hacking, if there's no violation of privacy, from a critical theory perspective, some people argue that when we use social media, for example, this is a form of exploitation, because we don't get paid, but we still give our data to these platforms, and they are sold, our data are sold to third parties, for example, for advertising purposes. If AI takes a more physical shape, we also have the problem that there can be safety issues. Robots used to be always in a safety cage, but once robots enter the daily life, homes of people, once also in industrial context, you have much more flexible, intelligent systems that can work in close collaboration with humans. Then you will have accidents, because technology is not perfect. There will be faults and errors, and so the question there is how to deal with that as compared to previous situations. Also, often ethical problems are discussed for a kind of standard people, but people are not standard. Everyone is different. People also belong to all kind of different groups and identities. One problem that there is that vulnerable users, like small children, can get attached to a robot which gets more intelligent, because the robot is much more able to mimic the human processes, like emotions, even if it's not real emotions. Users get attached to it. Now, if that's vulnerable persons like young children, then we should ask questions about that. Another problem is that AI that is used today and that is usually discussed is a kind of always different versions of machine learning. It's not always the case. Sometimes older forms of AI are used, where human domain experts have given input, and where decision tree is used, where human reasoning is used. But the AI that gets into the newspapers today is machine learning, and some of this kind of machine learning models are doing their work in a way that is not clear even to the developers, which means that we have an outcome, for example, a decision about a prison sentence, but this outcome from the AI cannot be explained. It's not the same as a human who can reason about this. We'll tell later why that's a problem. Biased algorithms, we already had that in the example that I gave of a false accusation. There was a bias against Black people there. In general, this is an important theme in our societies now. There is also bias in the data, so it's not always the algorithm that's biased. It can also be that the data are biased, or that the human teams that work with data, work with technology, are biased. So bias can arise in many forms and in various stages of data science processes. Some of these bias issues connect to gender, some to race and other identity-related issues. I find it quite interesting that in our language itself, and therefore also in our language corpora, in the text that are used by AI, because a lot of language-related AI uses data from the internet, so it goes through text on the internet, and this means that any bias that's actually there in this corpora and in this language, for example, the English language, also is taken up by the AI. So that's an interesting problem, I think, ethically, how to deal with that, because the bias is so deeply rooted. It's not just there in the algorithm, it's there in society. And for me, that's not a surprise, because AI is really embedded in a culture. I've used Wittgensteinian terms for that, games and forms of life, in using word and things to say more about that. So given that this is the case, what does this mean for responsibility? Well, if we go back to our story, then we see that this problem, these ethical problems in general and problems of responsibility are not really just philosophical problems. In the case of the story, there was really a problem that, there were people involved here who suffered, and there was a problem of responsibility. Why? Because one of the detectives said, I guess the computer got it wrong, meaning that this is a technical fault, we cannot help it, it's not our problem, it's not our responsibility. And this is really, really problematic, I think, when people try to evade responsibility by saying that technology did it. But we will have much more cases like this in the future if we continue to use more and more AI, not only in the legal system, but also elsewhere. Think about, for example, insurance, think about healthcare, and so on. Now, philosophically, moral philosophers, they ask the question then in such cases like how to attribute the responsibility. And for that, we have since Aristotle two conditions. One is a control condition and one is a knowledge condition. Control means that we ask when something happens, backward looking, who did it, and did this person do it voluntarily? And second, did this person know what she was doing? So these are two conditions that are very classic that we ask about humans. And the control condition is related to that question, like who is responsible, a typical question also in modern detective stories. Now, the problem is that technology cannot be held responsible because it lacks the required moral agency capacities. and it doesn't really know what it's doing because it's not aware, and so it doesn't have any form of consciousness. So humans have to be responsible, but then the question is which human? And if we look at the cases that with accidents with self-driving cars, for example, then you see that this is again a very practical and not just philosophical question. For example, in Arizona in 2018, a pedestrian died because a self-driving car in autonomous mode caused that accident. And the question is then, yeah, who is responsible? Is it the car maker? Is it the people who programmed the software, the AI software that drove the car? Is it Uber in this case who employed this kind of technology in its cars? Is it the operator who was actually in the car and who didn't intervene? Is it a pedestrian, because pedestrian might cross at a speed and at a place that can also contribute to the accident? And are the regulators sufficiently prepared for this? So with regard to technological action, philosophers of technology call this the problem of many hands. There are many people involved. And it's there are various views on who should be responsible. For example, in the legal system, we have these different directions. Tort law is more about whether there was negligence, whether someone exercised reasonable care or not. Whereas product liability says, well, Volvo in this case should be responsible. So there are various approaches to this. But I want here just to point to the problem. And this problem exists not only in self-driving cars, but always when AI and data science are used, because we have at all these different stages, people, many hands, right, who contribute to a certain outcome, contribute to often a very good outcome, but in these accident cases not, and then this question of moral responsibility is raised. The knowledge condition is also quite interesting, because the question is, if we have so much AI embedded in all kind of systems today, is it right that most of us don't really know what AI is, and don't really know in a way what Aristotle would call the instrument? So it's a kind of ignorance of the instrument that you use. So that is a problem. Also, what I already said, that even experts don't always understand the system. And socially also, when we go more to the social epistemology of this, that there could be also misunderstandings and ignorance between different groups in terms of communication. It could be that data scientists know their system very well, but not the engineers using it, let alone the user or the end user. So these are all problems about agency and the knowledge related to agency. Who did it? Did this person know what she was doing? But in an article that recently came out, I also point to another kind of responsibility, namely relational responsibility. We don't only have responsibility as agents for what we do, but we also have responsibility, I think, towards people, towards others. And then the question is, what does it mean then for artificial intelligence? Because if it's true that with some artificial intelligence systems we cannot really explain why this decision is taken, then we also cannot explain to people that are harmed or could be potentially affected by the technology. And I think this is really a big moral problem, but because as human beings we should be able, if we take decisions that affect others, to explain these decisions, to justify these decisions. And so here we get a big difference between the kind of knowledge produced by the AI based on probabilities, based on statistics on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of knowledge that is all about reasons. This is a big clash between different views of the world, different views of human beings that will continue to play up. And that's even more so since we are not only moral agents and moral agents that stand in relation to others, we are also subjects that try to make sense of what's happening to themselves and also at the collective level. And I think this is could be also a problem, because we do think that we should make sense of what's happening around us, and if there are technologies who do not enable this, then we also have a problem. So not just as rational agents that gives the justifications, but also just as cultural beings that interpret, as hermeneutic beings. This is something I'm currently working on, and I would like to further develop that. One kind of work that has already been done is working out what it would mean to say that technologies are narrative, that technologies are somehow part of human narratives and interpretation. I have done this work with Russell Reyers, and we wrote this book about narrative and technology ethics next to articles about this. So this is the background of my interest in that. But currently, I'm really looking specifically at AI and at a wider view of what it means, human sense making in connection with AI. In any case, we have these practical problems too, next to the understanding and the sense making, and it is very difficult issue, because if we don't know who is responsible, but also if we cannot explain, and both the sense making and the moral responsibility issues for me, I think, need to be also looked at in the context of the tragic. I already used this notion of the tragic long ago in a paper on engineering ethics, where I said, like, look, there are these human disasters and you can blame people, but in the end, moral responsibility is not absolute. There are always things that happen beyond our control, and shouldn't we also look at tragedy, a very specific form of narrative, of course. So narrative returns here again too, and shouldn't we look at this kind of cultural form to try to understand also technological disasters? So this is definitely, I think, for me important, because what you get if you have the moral responsibility without a tragic, then you have a very harsh kind of moral responsibility. I read Kierkegaard to talk about this. So it's a kind of in a way pointing to the limitations of all this talk about moral responsibility. Then something else that should also be noted is that we should also take into account that when we think of responsibility as responsibility too, that this is not only towards humans, but that we should at least ask the question if we also have responsibilities towards non-humans, and that's more and more important today when we consider global problems, not only a pandemic and all kind of problems, but especially climate change. Do we have responsibilities for solving this problem towards only human beings, or are there also environmental reasons to do this? I think that's an important question to ask, and it's also important in the case of AI, because AI can have this role in trying to make things better with regard to climate change. It can help climate science, for example. It can help us save energy. But I think it can also make things worse if we consider that we already have this enormous attitude of control, which we extend to the planet as a whole. And there the question is like, isn't that kind of hyper agency also very toxic for us and the planet? And isn't AI then also part of this tightening the grip on the earth? So again, here I connect AI with culture, with narratives. Here there's a narrative of the Anthropocene, where there is this hyper agency, and then the question, what do we do with it? What do we do in this crisis? In any case, from ethics, we can look at all kind of approaches that try to justify and so on that not only human beings count morally. So I think that's very relevant here. And also here, I think we have the responsibility to make sense of everything, which is very, very difficult when you're in a crisis situation. Think about the pandemic, but it's also the case in climate change. And there too, there is a tragic aspect to it. I think that you know, there are limits to control, and there should be limits to control as something ethical, not ethical in the sense of moral responsibility in modern sense, which can be very absolute and harsh, but more questions about how to live, how to understand ourselves, and how to deal with things that are outside of our control, which is a very ancient question. For example, the Stoics have some ideas on this. To conclude, because I cannot go through the whole history of ideas, neither do I want to, nor do I want to. So what I did here in this presentation was to tell you more about AI ethics, but also connect this to narratives, narratives that really, I think, frame the way we approach AI ethics. I've approached it in a way that was different from the dominant narratives. I think that responsible AI means this kind of more ethical and environmentally friendly AI. I have not so much, I've not really argued for this normative position here, but more mapped the problems. I do think, though, if you ask me, that yeah, we need to move towards that kind of AI, and that also that we need to be very aware, and that we need to study the limitations of AI if we put it in this narrative and cultural context, because making sense of the crisis that we face now is something that AI won't do for us. AI can give us statistical knowledge and give us probabilities, and that can help us in many ways, but we really need to make sense of it all ourselves. We need to develop also the critical distance from the narratives that dominate nowadays. And I think this can only be done, this kind of project of AI ethics, you know, in a more cultural understanding of technology, can only be done if we have also more you know, an education that's more interdisciplinary, where humanities and technical disciplines and computer scientists can meet, and also beyond academia, art, literature, and so on. We have many ways and many media that can make us aware, for example, of the tragic dimension of our lives, and that could be used to think about technology also. And we have all these, you know, ancient efforts to make sense of human lives, and I think by connecting back to them, we could find a new resource to find also to develop a fresh vision on what AI could be in the future for us, and what story we want to tell about ourselves with AI. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Coeckelbergh, for just such a wonderful, clear overview of some of the issues around AI and ethics and thinking about what we might prioritize going forward. So I want to just go ahead and open up the floor to questions. Perhaps as we wait for some of these questions to come in, I'll just start us off with a question about policy. And so this was something that wasn't so much in your talk, but I noticed in your biography that you have a lot of involvement yourself with advising policy. And if you could just talk a little bit about the situation, sort of the European policy around how AI is implemented and the effect that that has on society. Obviously, in the US, it's quite a different situation. And so what can we learn? What can we take from that example?
Well, I can report, if you like, that there has been this process with also this high-level expert group that I was part of to formulate principles for ethical AI and to recommend policies. I think this has also been done by many governmental and non-governmental organizations also all over the world, including in the US. And I think that there was an important stage, but now the question is like, will this actually be translated into regulation? And also, will it be translated in a way that that also companies, technical people, and so on can use in their daily practice? And that's the big challenge now. At the end of the high-level expert group, we had already some kind of assessment list, which was already more concrete. I worked there on the more societal and environmental issues. I think there are now many efforts globally to try to get to more concrete ways in which we can put ethics in the technology, make the technology more ethical. I think that's very important. With regards to the policy and the regulation, the European Commission will soon come up with a proposal for regulation. There was already, of course, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been an example to some countries in the world, and which many people looked at. The question is now if the European Commission and then also the other European institutions like the Parliament and so on, if they will really go for it, if they will really endorse regulating AI, and I have no idea how the actual regulation will look like. So I'm interested there, of course, to see if they will take up the advice that the expert group has given, if they will also take up all the efforts that are there everywhere in the world with people doing AI ethics, and if that is going to be translated in some concrete regulation. What I find important here is to indeed learn from each other. I think we can all learn from each other. So Europe can also learn from China, from US, to see how things are done there. But yes, Europe could play an important role here. I think, especially if they are now going to be the first to propose regulation. And so I think I see this as an opportunity for Europe to lead there, but we'll see what the actual regulation will be. And I don't have information about that. So let's see how it will be.
I noticed that you quoted Aristotle and referenced Mary Shelley. So my question is, how long has AI technically been around? And alternatively, how long have humans been worried about it?
Yeah, so of course, compared to that long history of thinking about the good life, thinking about narrative and culture, AI hasn't been around for very long, not so much more than a half a century. And I think it's important there to realize that when we have new problems, that these problems are new in the sense that the technology is new, but that they connect to ancient questions, and so that we can still also use to some extent the ancient solutions or at least discuss and see what we can use. Of course, one should always have a very critical relation to a tradition and shouldn't be just copying. But I think that yeah, we shouldn't do as if suddenly we are faced now with ethical problems that have never been heard of. They are new in a sense that it's AI, but yeah, I think we can see some patterns there. I showed that quote from Aristotle about ignorance, for example. A lot of these types of ignorance are still there, are also there in the case of AI. So the problems around responsibility and about how to lead our lives, I think, will continue to occupy us. And we can find inspiration in Aristotle and elsewhere for that.
So we have a question in the chat. What is your personal opinion on the macro level of job displacement due to AI that will occur in the future? And what specific jobs or industries do you think that AI will impact most?
I'm not an economist, so I didn't do research myself on that. I'm also not doing empirical research in general, but what I can say on the basis of what I read from the literature is that there will be definitely an impact, and we really need to prepare for the transition. The impact will be also so not only the blue collar workers, but also so-called white collar workers. So basically all the services, the things that now happen in offices will also be affected. Whereas of course in earlier industrial revolutions, things happened on the factory floor only. That will also happen, but I think now the new thing is really that that people working in offices will be not necessarily always replaced, but at least heavily augmented, monitored, and so on by these technologies. At least this is the possibility that's there from the technological side, and often technologies have been used in the past, and so probably it will be done there too. In terms of replacement, the percentages go from 9% to 47% of jobs that would be replaced. I don't think it will be that high, but in any case, yeah, there is discussion about that. I think from the takeaway lesson I took from that is that the takeaway message was that it will be significant, right? Even if it's just 10 or 20%, that's very significant. We should prepare for that in our societies and economies.
Thanking you for your talk, and wondering, in the context of AI, what is the difference between ethic and moral, or ethics and moral responsibility?
Yeah, these terms have been defined in many ways. I connect ethics with the ancient good life, but also with, I've been talking about ethical problems as a kind of general overall term. Moral for me is a more modern term to talk about moral responsibility, for example, and it's really about it's more about right and wrong than the good life is more about moral responsibility.
Question: how should college and university educators evolve to help prepare our students for the growing influence of AI in their lives and employment prospects? And sort of the other side of that, how can faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences think not only about preparing students for employment, but also about ethical behavior at work?
Yeah, so often the discussion is narrowed down to, okay, people have to learn new skills and have to be prepared for a job market. I think this should definitely not be the whole picture, and I've argued for this interdisciplinary education. So I think at the level of programs, universities, faculties, and so on, I think it would be great if we can create more at an institutional level, more this interdisciplinary thing, rather than have it as an exception, have it really built in. And then I think educators could also prepare students by discussing AI in their classes, by showing some critical dealing, coping with AI. And in that way, it's not really a skill like that you can learn, like learning to type with 10 fingers. it's more like something that you have to learn in the course of your education, I think, and preferably earlier than university. But I think to gain this critical relation to technology is important through the whole curriculum from early school to university. And so educators can do that. But they also need to, so we need to educate the educators. We need to prepare for that, make sure that research in this direction is translated into concrete programs. Yeah, this are my general ideas about this.
I really appreciate your point that your line of thinking that we need kind of the ability to be making sense about what's happened and help us support what could happen. And also you have a note in here, but it's not clear what explanations people need. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about I kind of really agree with that a lot. And I'm curious, how do we approach that? What do we do next? How do we start to unpack that and make progress?
When it comes to explanations that people need, there's also research on that, and it's clear that most of us don't actually need to see the code basically, or have all the technical details, but we need to be able to, for example, even if the decision is not made in that way, but we need to then try to justify it, right? Or the person who explains this to us needs to justify it. So what we want if an insurance person wants to makes a decision about how much we have to pay, for example, we want that person doesn't just say like, this is the outcome of the machine. The person needs to explain, justify in human terms why a decision is taken. So on the technical side, we need to provide somehow the inputs for that human work to be done. And on the human side, I think we need a kind of communication and pay much more attention to that communication that's important. I mean, it's so easy to say this is just a machine. I had it also once on the phone with my credit card company and so on. And in that case, they couldn't explain why my credit card was blocked. And it's just like, well, the algorithm decided that your credit card is blocked. So this is, because the algorithm thought in that case that there was a security breach. Okay, so and the person could not explain anything to me. Could not explain how I could avoid this and so on. So that's a situation we don't want to have. We want a situation where we can have human reasoning, human interpretation, and human sense making when something goes wrong also. And that might have a technical component, but it has a lot of other components too. Think about a plane crash and having to go as the person from the company that made the plane, having to explain to the people who lost their son, mother, whatever. That is kind of, I think, this relational aspect again, and the sense making, like how do we deal with this kind of things. And I think technology is part of that, and we really need to do a lot of work on the other sides too, I think.
So the first question was relating to the EU and the legal status of it. And I was wondering, in a paper of, I think, John Stewart Gordon, he has mentioned that in 2017, the EU has granted some sort of legal status to robotics and AI. And I was wondering how that has actually, throughout these 4 years that have passed since, changed the responsibility of AI and robotics, at least in the EU?
As far as I know, it was an issue that was suggested in a document for the European Parliament, to consider that, to consider giving legal personhood to machines. But as far as I know, that didn't really happen. That wasn't really translated into legislation. They just considered it, and it stirred up a lot because most people think that, well, these are just things, you know, we don't give it personhood. But the question is a bit more complicated, of course, because we already give some kind of legal personhood to companies, which are things. They're not people. So it's something to discuss. I personally don't think this is going to be the solution to our problems there. And I do agree with people who say that there needs to be a kind of connection, a line that needs to be traced back to human responsibility, given that machines cannot be responsible in a moral sense. And I mean, that's the kind of reasoning one could also, of course, then one could compare how we deal with the legal personhood of companies. And, you know, there I would defend the same thing. I would say, like, you know, it has to be able to be traced back to human beings, because otherwise we're going to have a problem. When people say, like, yeah, it's this thing, whatever, you know, the technology, the company. I think both technologies and institutions, which are kind of social technologies we have, are, you know, can I think they are great things, but they can also be used as a way to evade responsibility.
It seems to me that utilitarianism is perhaps the simplest approach to use in developing algorithms that are employed by AI. How can this one philosophical approach not dominate AI programming?
Yeah, good question. I agree that utilitarianism really fits very well with the kind of in a way with the operations that are going on in AI. So I think it is a dominant way of reasoning also by some philosophers who then really who lean closer to the natural sciences. But I think if we look broader, then we see that many moral considerations are in play. I personally think that I don't think that utilitarianism is totally useless or so, and I think I personally reason more as in a pluralist way, that I think that many moral theories have there is some truth in it, and they highlight one aspect influenced by pragmatism there. But yeah, I think to avoid this dominance of utilitarianism, it's good within moral philosophy to show other approaches, virtue ethics, for example, deontology, but also in a pragmatic context to in a way also show that this kind of reasonings, that it's not something objective to choose this approach, but that it's also a political choice, a moral choice to go one kind of direction. And so if it's the case that AI as a technology supports one way of thinking of morality rather than others in a certain context, then I think this is a kind of issue by itself that needs to be problematized, needs to be analyzed in terms of the politics and the power.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Coeckelbergh. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Great Q&A, wonderful lecture. And thank